Hi everyone, welcome to this edition of A Bit Lit. My name's Tom Harrison and I'm leading the discussion today on satire. And I'm really pleased to welcome my guest Becky Yearling today, who is going to speak to me about her ideas on satire and the early modern stage. So without further ado, Becky, hello once again.
Hello.
Would you mind just giving us an introduction to yourself and to your work, please?
Yes, certainly. So I'm Becky Yearling. I teach at the University of Kiel. My area is Renaissance literature, particularly drama, and within the drama of the Renaissance particularly, I'm interested in exploring audiences. So audiences have been the theme that have gone through all my research so far. I started off being interested in stage satire, which is obviously what we're going to talk about today, with my first book on that being Ben Jonson, John Marston and early modern drama, Satire and the Audience. And I'm interested in satire as a form that has a particular, quite complicated relationship with its audience. The question of, is it about entertaining the audience? Is it about reforming the audience? How does the text and the recipient, how do they interact? And I'm now moving on from that in my research. Now I'm still thinking about audiences, but in this case, moving on to look particularly at the plays of Shakespeare and focusing on the violence in plays. So think about why did audiences enjoy watching violence? How did they interpret it? Were there different ways of interpreting it? And what are the factors that might have shaped that audience response?
Mm. And of course, yeah, the idea of violence is on stage and off stage in this period is topic enough for another discussion, isn't it? But just to circle back to the point you make about text and its relationship with audience and particularly satire. Obviously, as you mentioned, Becky, we're going to be talking today about stage satire more than anything, but then alongside the plays that we might be talking about by Jonson, Marston, etc., we've also got this huge array of verse satire, or prose satire to a lesser extent, that was swirling around in the period, and some of the writers, Marston, for instance, wrote both verse satire and stage satire. So it's an interesting mixture, isn't it? And what we might think as being two quite separate things, modern readers might think verse satire is quite separate to stage satire. Actually, in the minds of writers, they perhaps weren't that distinct, that different. So just that was a very long-winded intro into my question on audience. Do you detect a difference in how audiences are addressed or regarded in the stage satires of, say, Jonson or Marston, or the verse satires that were around at the same time? So the written satire and the stage satire, is there a different way in which they regard audiences?
Yeah, but I think there are quite a lot of fundamental differences. I mean, part of the difference is just the difference in reading something and seeing it on the stage makes a big difference. That in the verse satires being written at the time tend to be done in the first person by a single speaker. And that single speaker they're often quite changeable speakers. Sometimes they're angry, sometimes they're more relaxed about the kind of things they're criticising. But they are the kind of voice of authority within the text. So you see everything through their eyes. They're able to guide the audience quite a lot, telling them what to think, basically. Whereas with stage satire, that question of authority becomes much more complicated, because there isn't, obviously, in a play, that same kind of authority. You might have characters who have more or less authorities. For example, a prologue, who often takes the role in some sense of the author, also author surrogate, talking to the audience, might be seen as having a bit more authority than just a regular character in the play. But even so, within a play, you get the characters. There's a sense more that you can judge for yourself, I think, as the audience to a play. You can see characters interacting. You can decide, is this person ridiculous or are they not? Should they be condemned or should they not? In a way that you can't really do with verse satire.
Yeah, and on a really basic experiential level, the focus is different, isn't it, between stage satire and verse satire, or I'll say written satire just for ease, because as you mentioned, Becky, you can look at different parts of the stage, can't you? You can focus on different characters. So whereas in an epigram by Jonson, or a satire by Marston or Donne, or one of those writers, you've got one perspective, more or less. You've got the writer's perspective through which to view their particular version of the world. On stage, you've got all these different things going on, and depending on where you focus at any one time, that's your reading of that scene and of that moment. So my view is that your experience of it can be quite different to the experience of engaging with a text. Maybe that's a bit too simplistic on my part. Maybe I'm just too much of a fan of the theatrical satire. But just on this point, actually, I feel like I've put the cart before the horse with this. What are your ideas, Becky, on what satire actually is? What did it mean in the period we're talking about?
That itself is quite a big question. I think one of the things with satire has always been the difficulties in drawing clear lines around it and saying kind of where it starts and where it stops. And I think at the heart of satire, there's pretty much always the idea of mocking or critiquing something that the satirist thinks is wrong with the world. So that could be big things. It can be whole philosophical beliefs or institutions or political systems or things like that. Or it can be very small things like people liking new clothes too much, or speaking in affected ways, or kind of little social issues. But it's generally about that there's something wrong with them, something that should be corrected. And I think that idea of correction feels really important to me. And then satire beyond that, I think the usual way of thinking of it is as a spectrum. So you've got, at the one end, the satires, which I suppose you've got invective at one end, and there's some debate about whether invective should be considered a form of satire or not. Invective being harsh critique when you are just having a go at something. You're saying this is awful. Often you're doing it in personal terms. You're certainly doing it in terms designed to hurt. And some people would argue it's not satire if it's just designed to hurt. Satire should be about correcting things. But some people would argue that invective is a form of satire. So at the one end, you've got just straight attack, basically. And at the other end of the spectrum, then, you move probably more into something like comedy, where comedy also is often about laughing at people behaving foolishly. But I think probably the difference between a comedy and a satire at that end of the scale would be, again, the corrective impulse in satire. To give an example, I think A Midsummer Night's Dream, the young lovers in the forest, in some ways are ridiculous. You could perhaps see that there's a note of satire in there about love makes people act madly. But I don't think the audience are being told, you should disapprove of these people, they should be corrected in some way. I think it's much more affectionate than that. Whereas I think if that moment was a satire, there'd be much more sense of they need to be put right, they need to be educated in some way, brought out of their folly.
Yeah, that's an interesting comparison to make, because we don't often think about Shakespeare as being a particularly satirical writer, do we? There are obviously satirical moments in his texts, but famously, he doesn't seem to have engaged in the sort of writing that people like Jonson, Marston seem to do in the so-called War of the Theatres. But the Midsummer Night's Dream thing, just to go back to that, that satire, or the satirical flavour in the presentation of the lovers is definitely there, isn't it? But also perhaps there's a satire on audiences at the end with the mechanicals, where we've got the nobles watching this mechanicals performance, and even though the mechanicals Pyramus and Thisbe is a complete disaster, really, in many respects, the reaction of the audience seems to be, whenever I watch that scene, I'm more irritated by the reaction of those onstage audience members than I am offended by the lack of skill of the actors. So that really keys into the point that you were making about audiences being really central to satire and satire's purpose.
And I think also one of the interesting things about the dreaming context of satire is Again, I think that idea that the play can have an effect on audiences can be a sort of magical thing when it works. Because obviously the end of that says you can think of this as just a dream, a passing fantasy, something that has no real substance, or you can think of it as a kind of genuine emotional experience that can transform people, that can make people's lives different in some way. I think there's a sort of sense of that at the end of A Midsummer Night's Dream. If you don't like it, you can just think this was just a dream. But if you do like it, there is that kind of sense that theatre can be magical. And I think that's one of the things that comes in a lot to Jonson's satires. Obviously, with something like The Alchemist, where I think there's that fundamental metaphor of transformation in The Alchemist. I think the Bitlet discussion on The Alchemist a few weeks ago talked about that aspect. The play is all about people who want to transform themselves. And again, there's the kind of question of where the audience fits in that transformation. Are the audience there, they've given their money, but actually they're just going to go away the same people as they always were? It's all been a con game. Or is there a sense that if they engage seriously with the fiction, they might learn something, they might genuinely be transformed and become better people as a result of exposure to, in that case, the satire of the play?
Yeah, and that is, and with Jonson in mind, that keys into the position that the Roman writer Horace had, that literature should profit and delight. So it should teach a lesson, and it should also entertain audiences in equal measure. And there is a lot of sort of quick movements, writers moving quickly between these. The impression that what they're doing is just a sort of entertainment. It's just a confection that people can enjoy and not take anything from. But also at the same time, there's an undercurrent of something else that's going on. And that's something that Jonson and Marston definitely engage with and seem to play a lot of games with as well. You know, I know that you've written previously about how Marston always seems to want to wrong foot his audience in terms of generic expectations and tone. And there's a lot of moments in his plays when we can't quite work out what's going on because a supposedly comic scene is suddenly turned on its head and becomes tragic, or, you know, a character that was previously admirable suddenly does something that's horrendous. And so do you think Marston is particularly representative of the particular version of satire of the say late 16th century, or do you think he's out on a limb doing something completely bizarre and unusual?
Well, I think that question of what is satire for, and the question of essentially does it have one audience or two audiences, I think it's something that preoccupies a lot of satirists. It's not just Marston. I mean, going right back into the classical satirists. So I think the worry about complacency within satire is there, certainly in Jonson as well as Marston, that idea that the audience might just be sitting there thinking, this is all very funny, I'm having a nice time, those people on stage are ridiculous, they're nothing like me, I'm better than them, so I can laugh at them. And Jonson, of course, is very eager not to allow that kind of complacency, that kind of stepping back from the fiction. He keeps saying to his audience, this is about you, remember that. And I think that's something that is a technique that's also used in the classical verse satirists and so on, of saying, again, you may be laughing at these comical characters, but your own name could be inserted at this point. This could just be a portrait of you, and you're not recognising it at the moment. Yeah,
and this is something my own sort of research interests tap into this, because that is the idea of the worries about complacency and the reflexive nature of satire is something that comes up again and again in the Roman satirists. And just to tell or remind viewers about Roman verse satire and its importance in the early modern period. Roughly speaking, I think we can agree, Becky, that roughly there were sort of two opposing poles of satire in the period. One of them was occupied by a satirist called Juvenal, who wrote very sort of biting, caustic satires that attacks people and seems to be full of anger and vitriol and all that sort of fun stuff, essentially. And at the other end, there's Horace, who I've already mentioned, who is a writer prior to Juvenal that writes in a more ironic, detached, genial way, but is still exposing issues in their society. And one of the more famous satires by Horace opens with a picture of people who essentially don't like their lot in life. It's a sort of grass is always greener sort of depiction where they talk about say a soldier wishes that he had a different life, and a farmer says, oh well, a soldier's got it great. A soldier can just rush into battle and die or gain glory, and then it's all over. That's not the real hard grind, and so on and so forth. But then towards the end of the satire, the voice suddenly changes, the perspective suddenly changes, and I've got the quote in front of me. I'm not just straight from my head. The persona says, what are you laughing at? Change the name and you are the subject of the story. And that's a really interesting moment in that satire, because as you say, Becky, it's that moment of acknowledgement from the writer that actually you can just swap in any person into that situation. We all have that dissatisfaction with our lives, and envious tendencies when we look at how other people are living, and that's that's one of the things that's really interesting, and we see time and time again in later satires. And I suppose as well, that's just to go back again to a point you made earlier about verse satire having a sort of unified approach. One of the really interesting things about satire is that actually we do get voices intruding into the satire, and we can't quite work out all the time whether it's the dominant persona of the satire, so the Horace persona, or whether it's some other character that's just snuck in. And Marston seems to do that quite a lot, doesn't he, in his poems and in his drama?
He does do that, and also I think with Marston, and there's also the further complication of the inherent instability of the satirist. You're never quite sure whether the satiric voice is sincere in what he's saying, or whether he's kind of playing a game, playing the role of an angry satirist where he's not really. Because certainly Marston ends, he's got 2 volumes of verse satire that he writes early in his career, and he ends the second one saying, although I seem to be angry when I was writing these, yet I have written sporting merriment, I think is what he says. So it's the idea the whole thing was a kind of, I don't know, it raises the question, was this a sort of parody of satire writing? Was the joke actually on the satirist all along rather than on all the people he was critiquing?
Yeah.
Was he making fun of the person who thinks it is their job to fix society?
Mm.
So yeah, that sense of instability of different voices, of different perspectives coming in, seems to be something that fascinated him.
And you get that constant hall of mirrors effect, don't you? Where if you have this pose at the end, that was just sporting merriment. Why would you think anything else other than that? Only a foolish person would think that this was real satire. It changes. It encourages you to change your opinion, but then at the same time, you've got this moment where you think, well, actually, is there another joke being played here? And if I fall into the trap of thinking it's a joke being played on me, maybe I'm not taking it as sporting merriment, and so on and so forth. It just infinitely goes on and on. So yes, yeah. So Marston seems to be particularly good at that. Jonson seems to be particularly interested in that sort of pose. And you mentioned The Alchemist, and I know that you've written on Jonson's earlier works. What sort of differences do you detect between or across Jonson's career? So, if we think very broadly, Jonson starts with comedies that are more obviously satirical. A lot of people view them as being written in the Juvenalian mode, so more attack worthy than anything else. But then he seems to shift into something else. So do you have any thoughts on that yourself, Becky? on that movement?
Yes, well, I think with Jonson there was always a kind of tension in him between an attraction to quite an authoritarian position on satire. I think he really liked the idea of the satirist. It's going back to the really early satiric models of the very, very early Greek invective writers, the iambists, people like Orchilochus. And Orchilochus comes up in the apologetical dialogue that was attached to the print edition of Poetaster, one of Jonson's early plays. And in that he talks about how Jonson talks about how he would like to be able to rhyme people to death, armed with Orchilochus's fury. And Orchilochus was supposed to have been this very early Greek poetry writer who was able. He drove, I think it was his ex-fiancée and his ex-father and her father to suicide through his verses. So that idea of being this kind of satirist who could just have that kind of almost visceral physical power over the bodies of other people, could control them, could punish them, could hurt them, could tell them what to do, how to think. I think there's quite a strong impulse towards that in some of Jonson, but there's also a kind of sense that audiences are not necessarily going to like that, of being attacked, being set upon, being humiliated in front of other people, those kinds of things. So I think I would see Jonson's development as being initially trying to be more authoritarian, telling people, really, basically giving people two options and saying, these are idiots and these are good people, and you can choose which camp you want to belong to.
Yeah.
And it's not very complicated in some ways. I mean, the plays themselves, the early plays, are different from each other and in their own way quite experimental, quite interesting. But I think satirically they're not particularly complicated. They do tend to give you just... There is no debate about who is a fool and who is a wise man for the most part in those plays. And Jonson just kind of tells the audience they should clearly want to be with the wise men, they shouldn't want to be like the fools. And I think as Jonson goes on, he starts to become less authoritarian. I don't think that urge ever totally left him, but I think he starts to become more playful, more inclined to kind of do Marstonian things, to kind of trick the audience, make the audience think they're watching one kind of drama and then pull the rug out from under their feet later on. Set up things that seem to be serious, but then they turn out to be jokes. And I think that's the kind of thing we see developing from, in the kind of comedies that are seen often as Jonson's most important ones, best ones. Things like Volpone and The Alchemist and Bartholomew Fair. I think they're much less confrontational satire from that point of view.
And yeah, and ironically, as a result, they seem to have a more lasting impression on readers and audiences. People seem to want to engage with those later plays much more than the earlier ones, presumably for that very reason, that people don't like being lectured to, really, do they? Particularly when you're going to the theatre and paying whatever it is to go and stand there and just be told, oh, well, you're an idiot, or you're a wise person, and so on. Just on that note, there's often a I don't know whether you'd say it's a criticism or a comment on satire, that it's very, very good at pulling down, but not very good at building up. So characters and writers are able to identify flaws in their society and in other people, but they're not able to remove the mote from their own eye, if you will. Do you think that is the destructive quality of satire, as opposed to the constructive? Do you think that's a problem with the genre, if we can call it a genre, or is it something that is actually quite useful?
I think, in general, with satire, just the fact that you're satirising something in the first place suggests that there is a standard by which you're satirising it. So if you're saying this person is, again, to take a very trivial example, if you're saying this person is spending all their money on new clothes, obsessed with their appearance, it's a waste of their money, it's a waste of their life to be bothered with something so minor, then you're obviously implying that a better person would be somebody who treated clothes as less important. So there is, I think, always, I think satire doesn't work unless there's some kind of sense of the behaviour is wrong.
Yeah,
and therefore not doing that behaviour would be better.
yes, we could do better. Yeah, but sort of implied negatively. Yeah.
But I think sometimes though satire does kind of raise those larger questions. And I think again, Marston is particularly interested in this, the idea sometimes of worlds that have gone so mad that how do you get back to any kind of normality if everybody in a society is out of control, if there's no real figure of authority and order and reason? What happens at that point? You just kind of accept it and go, well, this is what we've got. Or do you battle against it? Sometimes in those plays you get satirist figures who are just one man in a world gone insane around them, and they're kind of trying to sort things out, trying to say, please don't be like this, but everyone else is saying, we're having a lovely time, we're enjoying our clothes and parties and drunkenness and everything else. There seems no particular reason for those people to get back onto the straight and narrow.
Yeah, in that way, Marston seems like quite a playwright for our times, really, doesn't he? That he offers these chaotic worlds where everything's turned upside down, but he doesn't seem to offer solutions in the way that, or a sort of outright condemnation in the way that Jonson does. We can't always work out what's going to happen by the end of the plays because Marston upends things so much. Are there any particular plays that you have in mind of Marston's when you're thinking about that sort of that perspective on the world?
I think his, again, fairly early play What You Will is a good example of that. That What You Will is very much a society where there's the Duke in What You Will, who's obviously as the authority figure within society you would hope would be a kind of figure of order. And he's not, and he is in some ways one of the most disorderly characters in the play. He spends all night out partying. He comes in, he goes to bed at noon. When some petitioners come to him and ask him to help them out with some legal cases, and I think he lights his pipe with the petitions and goes out dancing. And there is just that sense of, well, there is no voice of authority within this world. And again, you've got a satirist figure who's trying to fix things, but is not really able to. And I think Marston's really torn about this, because I think on the one hand, he does see the fun in all of this, that there is this kind of sense in him, I think, that playfulness and eccentricity are kind of part of the human condition. And it's foolish to ignore them or deny them. And also, in some ways, it's man's capacity for invention and fantasticness that makes him different from an animal, essentially. The imagination, all those kinds of ideas. But at the same time, there's also that kind of sense of, again, this society just seems to have no sense of stability or anything that matters in it. And there's also a kind of depressingness about that, where it's just parties. And the title, What You Will, is very suggestive from that point of view, that it's whatever you want. It's that there's nothing that has to be said or needs to be done or anything at all. It's the play is what you want to make of it. The world is what you want to make of it. And from one perspective, that's permissive and liberating, and from another perspective, that's quite worrying.
Yes, yeah. Very interesting that What You Will title applies to the characters and to the audience as well. It goes right back to the point you were making earlier about a satirist pose always being on, a satirist is always on shifting sands and always sort of saying, well, you can look at it this way, you can look at it that way, etc. So it's it's a very confusing play, isn't it? But an interesting one. Okay, I think we are just about coming to an end of our time now. So, Becky, I've got to ask the monumental question at this point that the Bitlit team have been asking contributors in general. What does literature mean to you?
I think literature is a text that you can go back to and see something else in it. So obviously there are lots of things that you can read over and over again and they're comforting, but I think in literature you get more out of it the second time. You'll notice things you haven't noticed before.
Oh, that's great. And I suppose that works. How does that work with satire? How does satire qualify as literature, do you think?
And I think with Marston and Jonson, the fact that all the things we've been talking about, the fact that it's very difficult, particularly in mid-period Jonson and pretty much all of Marston's works, to know what you're supposed to think or where you should stand. Is the author a kind of friend of yours, or is he an enemy who's trying to trick you in some way into making a fool of yourself? The fact that I used to think that The Alchemist was a play that was quite hostile to its audience, that was really out to make them look like idiots. And I've changed my view so much on that. I teach it at the moment, so I read it every year at least once. And I've now come to see it as a play that's actually really trying hard to push its audience. It wants to believe in its audience. It wants its audience to respond in a way that Jonson approves of. And therefore, it's not trying to trick them. It's trying to make them be good spectators, while also perhaps having some cynicism about how whether that will actually work, whether they will respond in the way that he's hoping.
Yeah, so he's always doing that "do better, be better" sort of mantra in his later plays. Yes, yeah, and how interesting that your engagement with that play is enacting the sort of things we've been talking about in satire. You know, you think one thing and then you think another. It's always changing, always in flux. So that's about it. Viewers, listeners. Just to let you know, Marston and Jonson have been our particular focus for this podcast. But there's loads and loads of did I call it a podcast? It's not a podcast. YouTube broadcast. There are loads and loads of other writers and playwrights out there that you must, if you're interested in satire, get your teeth into, get interested in. Thomas Nash in particular. Is a particularly good one. Any particular recommendations from you, Becky, for satirists?
Just some obvious ones. I think Erasmus and Thomas More, particularly The Praise of Folly and Utopia. I think an awful lot. We didn't talk about that today, but I think an awful lot of what's interesting about Jonson and Marston comes from the two of those, from those early humanists.
Yes.
Yeah.
So there is a wealth of material out there: playwrights, verse satire, prose works like Utopia and so on. So please go away and read some satirical materials, everyone. And thank you very much, Becky. Great discussion, and hope to speak to you at some point face to face in the future. Thank you very much. See you later, everyone.
Bye.